Ukraine has reportedly struck a $2 billion Russian Kinzhal Hypersonic missile depot. But what happened next has shocked military analysts worldwide.
Roughly $2 billion went dark in one night. A hardened underground complex tied to Russia's Kinzhal Hypersonic missile cycle stopped behaving like a depot and started behaving like a cratered liability. Aircraft were kept on the ground, launch rotations were rewritten, and at least one strike package was canceled before dawn. And the gut punch is this: a weapon sold as unstoppable is only unstoppable while it's available. When the storage and prep chain is broken, the missile doesn't matter. Stay with us, because the twist is not that Ukraine struck deep in western Russia, Bryansk Oblast. The twist is what happened after: the silence, the sudden absence of routine, and the way a rear area safe zone became a timing trap. It wasn't chaos, it was calculation. They called it a strategic rear area missile storage zone for a reason. Distance buys confidence. Depth buys time. Concrete buys denial. But dependency always builds a map, and maps can be burned. In this story, the target is a Kinzhal Hypersonic Missile Storage and Preparation Complex, an underground hardened depot supporting MiG-31K launch rotations. Not a frontline battery, not a radar on a hill, a back-end node. And when a back-end node fails, the front-end weapon becomes a display model. 2:14 a.m. A routine cycle breaks, preparation schedules pause, and readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. Russia did not lose a building, Russia lost tempo. And in missile warfare, tempo is the currency that buys coercion. No clean handoff, no predictable rotation, no guaranteed stock access. The trigger wasn't a miracle strike. It was a change in conditions, one that made the complex worth hitting at that exact moment. For weeks, rear area facilities like this live on rhythm. Convoys arrive, components get staged, security shifts rotate, documentation gets signed, vault doors open on schedule, then close again. That rhythm is the shield, because when everything is routine, nothing looks urgent. But then something changed. A concentration formed, a peak moment where storage, preparation, and launch planning overlapped. It could be a convoy movement timed to a weather window. It could be a redeployment cycle, MiG-31K rotations needing a fresh batch. It could be a shift transition when human attention thins and procedures become muscle memory. Whatever the specific trigger, the result is operationally simple. More assets in one place, more handling activity, more dependency on clocks. And clocks are exploitable. 4:03 a.m. A rear area routine compresses into a single vulnerability window. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. Russia's confidence comes from doctrine. Doctrine says hardened underground storage is survivable. Doctrine says rear areas are protected by distance and layered air defense. Doctrine says the real threat comes high and loud: fast jets, cruise missiles, ballistic arcs. So they built for the wrong layer. They prepared to stop the obvious, high-altitude, high-signature threats. They prepared to shoot the arrow they could see. What they ignored was the underside, low-altitude approach paths, logistics timing, sensor overload, maintenance gaps, reload cycles, and the one thing doctrine hates to admit: a protected system still has to open its doors. No open doors, no handling, no preparation, no launch, no coercion. This wasn't protection, it was rigidity. Because a depot that must be accessed on schedule is a depot that reveals itself through patterns. 5:41 a.m. security becomes procedural instead of adaptive. Coverage thins during routine transitions, and Russia loses options before the first blast is even confirmed. Ukraine's patience is the unglamorous part, and it's the decisive part. Deep strikes aren't only about range. They're about restraint. No broadcasts, no noise, no early strike, no celebration, no warning, no wasted shots. Ukraine doesn't need to hit every target. Ukraine needs to hit the one target that forces Russia to pause. So the waiting begins. Observation and discipline aimed at one condition: concentration. If you knew a hypersonic weapon's value was not the missile, but the cycle around it, where would you wait? If you knew the safe zone survives on schedule, what happens when you break the schedule? 7:12 a.m. The pattern locks in, assets are present, handling activity rises, and readiness shifts from stored to in process. Readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. That's the trap condition forming. When a missile is in a depot, it's safe. When it's being prepared, it's exposed. Not because it's fragile, because it's busy. Busy means vehicles moving. Busy means doors opening. Busy means communications between units that normally sit quiet. And then comes the signal that matters most in modern war: the absence. A missing routine can be louder than any transmission. A rear area node that goes quiet at the wrong moment is not calm, it's fear. Ukraine watches for the negative space: fewer vehicles than expected, or too many, fewer radios, or suddenly disciplined silence. Because silence can mean we see you. 9:08 a.m., movement drops below normal without explanation, command hesitates, and that hesitation costs Russia at least one launch window. Silence is the warning signal. Not explosions, not sirens. The real alarm is when routine stops and nobody announces why. Now Russia reacts, but to the wrong thing. Defenders are trained to chase the obvious. They see decoys. They see false contacts. They see high-altitude distractions. And they spend expensive defense time and expensive interceptors to destroy almost nothing. This is where cheap versus expensive becomes a weapon. A low-cost decoy forces a high-cost interceptor decision. A cheap drone forces $1 million radar posture. A small swarm forces a layered system to reveal its sequencing. Efficiency became exposure. 11:22 a.m., air defense is retasked to the wrong quadrant, attention shifts, and a gap opens over the real node. Throughput drops not to zero, but low enough to matter. No coverage where it matters. No certainty. No clean picture. No radar priority. No perfect intercept. No confidence. This is how rear area complexes die. Not by brute force, but by misalignment. The 10-second window is not poetic. It's operational. It's the moment a commander looks up at one problem and stops looking down at another. Ukraine doesn't need minutes. Ukraine needs seconds, when the layered posture is angled away, when the depot is safe by assumption, when routines are mid-step. 12:57 p.m. The window opens. Brief, narrow, decisive. Russia loses initiative because the system is looking elsewhere. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. The strike itself is described later as precise. That word is overused, but here it matters. Precision isn't only accuracy. Precision is timing against dependency. You hit the thing the weapon depends on. You hit storage and preparation, not the myth. And the effect is not only damage, it's finality, a verdict on availability. What followed wasn't a warning, it was a bill. 2:16 p.m. reports shift from incident to interruption, sortie planning is rewritten, and at least one strike package is delayed. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. Now comes the post-strike autopsy. A Kinzhal storage and preparation complex is not a pile of missiles in a room. It is controlled access. Environmental management. Handling equipment, security procedures, documentation, transport coordination. It is a chain of small certainties that produce one large capability. Break enough links, and the weapon becomes theoretical. No sealed storage certainty. No predictable prep timeline. No guaranteed sortie support. And because this complex supports MiG-31K launch rotations, the consequence isn't abstract. Aircraft can fly without missiles. Missiles can sit without aircraft. But the Kinzhal effect, the political pressure, the we can hit anywhere messaging only exists when the chain is smooth. 3:44 p.m. The chain stutters, ground crews, slow operations, and readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. Here is the cheap versus expensive contrast again, and it's brutal. A relatively low-cost strike package compared to the value stored forces Russia to protect or replace a $2 billion capability ecosystem. A cheap drone can't outfly a hypersonic missile, but it can bankrupt the schedule that makes the hypersonic missile usable. This is the paradox Russia built for itself. Prestige weapons demand prestige infrastructure. Prestige infrastructure is fixed. Fixed things are targetable. The system worked. That's why it failed. 6:02 p.m. command shifts to damage control, resources are diverted inward, and Russia loses time that can't be recovered. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. Within 6 hours, the visible effects are predictable. Perimeter lockdowns, road restrictions, new checkpoints, emergency engineering teams. But the real effects are invisible. The doubt inside the planning rooms. Planners hate uncertainty. And nothing creates uncertainty faster than a rear area node that was supposed to be untouchable, getting touched. If the rear is vulnerable, what is frontline even supposed to mean? If hardened underground storage can be disrupted, where does Russia hide the next rotation? If the schedule is broken once, how many times will it be broken again? 8:19 p.m. Operational planning starts hedging, launch rotations are spaced out, and readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. Now we move into the 24-hour collapse. Russia's first instinct is to restore normalcy, because normalcy is deterrence. But restoration requires truth. What is damaged, what is contaminated, what is compromised, what is missing. And in a missile complex, missing doesn't always mean destroyed. It can mean inaccessible. It can mean unsafe to handle. It can mean the wrong temperature, the wrong power state, the wrong door alignment, the wrong lift mechanism. No access, no handling, no launch preparation, no sortie loadout, no pressure campaign. This wasn't protection, it was rigidity. 10:47 p.m. engineers replace urgency with caution, operations slow, and throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. Then comes the second silence, the absence that scares professionals. Not the absence of explosions, the absence of routine radio chatter, the absence of confident statements, the absence of "we are fully operational." When an organization is fine, it says so. When it's not fine, it goes quiet and works the problem. Silence is the real warning signal. 1:33 a.m. public messaging stalls while internal reporting spikes, confidence fractures, and Russia loses options as uncertainty spreads. No clear timeline, no public proof, no restored rhythm. Cheap versus expensive again, a small number of incoming threats forces a massive defensive posture adjustment. Russia spends on perimeter. Russia spends on patrols. Russia spends on intercept readiness. And all of that spending doesn't create missiles. It just tries to protect the place that makes missiles possible. Efficiency became exposure. 4:20 a.m., MiG-31K rotations become tentative. Launch planning is paused, and readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. Now we reach 72 hours, where the story turns strategic. Because by day 3, Russia has to choose, rebuild the same pattern, or change it. Changing it means moving assets, shifting storage, dispersing inventory, rewriting procedures, and accepting slower cycles. Rebuilding it means returning to routine and betting Ukraine can't do it again. But dispersion has a cost. More movement, more convoys, more signatures, more points of failure. Centralization has a cost. One node becomes decisive. Russia built dependency to gain efficiency. Ukraine exploited dependency to create paralysis. It wasn't chaos, it was calculation. 7:05 a.m. A dispersion order begins, logistics reroute, and Russia loses tempo. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. No quick return. No clean replacement. No immediate deterrence. And now, the takeaway is not moral. It's mechanical. Modern warfare is not decided by who owns the most advanced headline weapon. It's decided by who can remove availability. Because availability is what produces pressure, and pressure is what produces political outcomes. 9:38 a.m. Availability collapses into scheduling. Russia shifts from strike when we want to strike when we can. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. This is where the humiliation is quiet. Not destroyed aircraft on a runway, though that happens elsewhere. Not a burning ship, though that draws cameras. Here, it's paperwork, timelines, conditional readiness, delayed cycles. This wasn't a battlefield defeat. It was a systems defeat. 11:52 a.m. leadership demands restored capacity, but reality answers with delays. Russia loses initiative because the chain can't be rushed. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. No instant fix. No perfect redundancy. No simple workaround. And in that gap, Ukraine gains something that doesn't show up in photos. Predictability control. Because when Russia is confident, it strikes on schedule. When Russia is shaken, it strikes opportunistically. Opportunistic strikes are less efficient, less coordinated, and easier to anticipate. So here's what that matters. A rear area disruption forces frontline consequences because the weapon's threat is not its speed, it's its reliability. 2:07 p.m. frontline plans adjust to rear area uncertainty. Russia loses time, and that time removes at least one launch window. The cheap versus expensive contrast returns one more time because it defines this entire event. A relatively cheap strike sequence can force Russia to treat a $2 billion ecosystem like it's fragile. A low-cost pressure tool forces high-cost defensive behavior. And the most expensive part isn't the repairs, it's the lost opportunity. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. Now lock in the key verdicts: cold, simple, unavoidable. Prestige created predictability. The system worked. That's why it failed. This wasn't protection, it was rigidity. Efficiency became exposure. 4:49 p.m. The calendar becomes the enemy, Russia loses tempo, and readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. And this is the explicit loss you can measure every 400, 500 words. Something is taken away. Russia loses initiative. Russia loses confidence. Russia loses time. No initiative. No tempo. No guaranteed coercion. Now we end the mid-script section with the line that matters most, because it captures the strategic humiliation without theatrics. 6:28 p.m. recovery becomes the mission. Strike planning pauses, and Russia loses options as the week's rhythm breaks. From that point forward, Russia wasn't choosing when to strike, it was waiting to be ready again. The final lesson is not about hypersonics. It's about dependency. Russia built a hypersonic narrative: unstoppable speed, unavoidable impact, strategic terror. But terror requires repetition. Repetition requires logistics. Logistics requires nodes. And nodes can be found, stressed, and cracked. If you were Ukraine, would you waste effort chasing the missile in the sky or the chain on the ground? If you were Russia, how do you defend a rear area when the rear is now inside the war? And if this is what happens when one depot is disrupted, what is the next weakness? Fuel, maintenance, command links, or airfield cycles? 8:03 p.m. The strategic picture hardens. Russia shifts from confident posture to cautious posture. And that caution costs at least one launch window. No certainty, no clean deterrence, no uninterrupted cycle. Silence returns as the final warning signal. The absence of routine strikes, the absence of confident timetables, the absence of business as usual. In intelligence work, silence is never neutral. Silence is a symptom. 10:26 p.m. The week ends with reduced throughput, Russia loses tempo, and throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. That is the verdict of Bryansk Oblast, Western Russia, inside a strategic rear area missile storage zone. A Kinzhal Hypersonic missile storage and preparation complex was treated like a fortress. Ukraine treated it like a schedule, and schedules can be broken. So the real question now is simple. If Russia's most expensive weapons depend on fixed, predictable chains, where do you hit next? Comment your take. Like, subscribe, and follow for more clear breakdowns.